lecture, or like wisdom talks, as we like to call it. So thank you for being present and being a wonderful audience. Today's topic is on the wheel of rebirth. It's actually a very, very important topic in Buddhism, right? The question is, what does the Buddhist tradition believe with regards to what happens after we die, right? And an interesting question that I like to pose at the start of this is, if you think about a caterpillar, a cocoon, and then a butterfly, the question is the caterpillar, that cocoon, and the butterfly three separate things? Or three separate beings? Or are they the same being, but just in different forms? Right? That's something to think about as we go through this entire talk, right? Are they the same beings? But they're not, right? They're caterpillar, cocoon, and butterfly, okay? So, what happens after the afterlife? A lot of the times religions tend to explore this issue a lot, and different religions have different interpretations of what really happens. But for the Buddhist tradition, it believes that nothing is apart from the cycle of rebirth. Because the universe and the way that the nature actually functions, everything deals with rebirth, right? And so that's a central tenet or theme of what happens, or at least how the Buddhist tradition thinks about the afterlife. And so they give us examples of what happens in the real world. For example, water. When you think about water, what happens to water? If you travel through the water cycle, right? At first, you just have water, and then it starts evaporating. You guys know this. And then it condenses into a cloud, and then it starts to rain, and then you have water again. And then notice, if you observe this, water exists in a cycle, right? Very much like seasons exist in a cycle. It's just the same cycle over and over again. Spring, summer, fall, winter, and then spring, summer, fall, winter. Everything is in a cycle, right? And there's an example that they give, which is like cars, right? What happens with cars? Cars use gas. The gas becomes CO2. And then what happens to the CO2? It gets breathed in by plants and trees, right? They breathe it in, they spit out oxygen. Ultimately, what happens to plants and trees when they die? They go to the ground and they become, they decompose, and they ultimately become natural oil again. And then those natural oil is used by the cars. And so there's a cycle that goes on in the real world, in the natural phenomena. And one last example that they gave us is our bodies. It's very interesting. We know that our bodies are constantly growing older, right, and maturing. However, an interesting fact that I found was that our bodies, as you guys know, are made up of individual cells. And those cells are actually constantly multiplying and then dying at the same time. And so you might think that, for example, if you're 25 and then 7 years later you're 32, you might think that, oh, you have the same body. However, it's very, very interesting that because our cells are in this constant process of multiplying and dying, we actually don't have the same bodies, because at the end of 7 years, none of the original cells that were in our body 7 years ago remains. We are technically within a completely different body after 7 years because no cells are of the original cells, right? So that's really interesting. That's basically saying our physical nature is transforming, but we stay the same, right? Hence, this idea of, within Buddhism, the wheel of rebirth. So the Buddhist tradition believes that when you guys, there are 6 realms of existence, right? There's the human realm, animal realms, and you can technically be reborn into lower realms as well. You could be ghosts with cravings, demons with anger, or ultimately you can be in the higher realm and become a heavenly being. So the question is, why are we here talking about this whole cycle of rebirth to begin with, right? the idea is that existence, like we exist, our existence belongs on a continuity. It doesn't end at death, right? A lot of people think like, oh, when we die, and this is kind of like a weird topic, especially talking with younger people, like what happens when we die. A lot of people think like when we die, that's it, that's the ending, the finale. However, within the Buddhist tradition, right, death is just the beginning of a new life. And that's an interesting concept to perceive and to understand and to view it. What else? It talks about how, like, whether you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter like what position you are in life, like you're ultimately subject to this idea, everyone's subject to this idea of like the wheel of rebirth, right? Ultimately, time is the judge, and so as time presses forward, we ultimately get to that stage where we arrive at death. And the question is, what happens at death? The reason, and it's interesting because the reason why I think like, well, not necessarily what I think, but this idea of rebirth is really important is because it explains, well, what controls where we land on our rebirth, right? If you think about it, there are different places that we can land, right? We can be humans again, or we can go lower and become animals again, or we can be even lower and like become like ghosts and demons, or even in the like lower realms of hell, or we can go up to the higher realms and be heavenly beings. So what's the thing that determines where we are placed when we are being rebirthed, right? And the answer is ultimately you're reborn based on the amount of merits that you are putting in your present life, right? It's basically your karma that's controlling your rebirth. And this concept is really interesting because it kind of like teaches you, like, you gotta do good in this present life because it helps with your future life as well, right? And it also technically takes away from this idea that God decides like where you go and where you are reborn. Rather, you get to decide your own destiny and where you go when you're reborn. If you put in enough good deeds and you put in enough merits into this lifetime, it ultimately helps you out. And the analogy that they give us is basically like if you're a rock, right? If you throw a rock into a river, what happens to the rock? It ends up sinking. However, if you put a rock on even a wooden plank on top of a river, that rock's going to be floating, right? And so the wooden plank, or the boat, as we would call it, represents all your like merits and your good deeds and stuff like that. So if you're able to put in a lot more good deeds, you won't necessarily sink to the low level. You'll be able to float, basically, is what they would like to say. All right. Yeah, the question is, do we believe or not believe in this idea of rebirth? As I mentioned before, as I opened this idea up, everything in nature exists in cycles, right? And so the question becomes, what makes humans the exception, right? Like, if everything exists in constant cycles of like birth and rebirth, why are we not subject to the same idea of birth and rebirth? Another question is it beneficial? Is it beneficial to have this idea of rebirth to begin with? Well, you can answer that question with, is it desirable to have a life without rebirth? Like, for example, just living this life and having it end. Like, when you die, this life ends, and then there's no meaning past this life. That's not necessarily beneficial to have either, right? A lot of the times, people ask, well, if this concept of rebirth is true, how come I don't remember my past life? That's kind of interesting too. And there are like famous examples of rebirth, for example, with the Dalai Lama, how he's born constantly in the next life, or the idea that he knows exactly where he's going to be born, and he tells like the people who follow him, like, look for me here, because this is where I'm going to be reborn. But the question is, like, why don't I remember my past life? Well, the Buddhist tradition states that like people pass through an intermediate stage. So when they die, they pass through this intermediate stage, and then they could stay there for up to like 49 days before they are reborn again into another different vessel, right? And that's that. Finally, the question is, how do we affect rebirth? Very much like I mentioned before, right? The accumulation of merits, good deeds, etc. is the number one item that actually affects rebirth, because your karma is the thing that determines your rebirth, into which realm you are reborn into. So I've had like interesting thoughts about this, and so I opened this like lecture at the beginning with this idea of like, you know, the caterpillar, the cocoon, and the butterfly. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Like, are they the same thing or are they different things, right? Like, let's just say a caterpillar who does have a certain specific personality, right? It becomes a cocoon, and a cocoon is just like there. It's just maybe in a womb, to sort of, and it becomes a butterfly. Now a butterfly has like this other different personalities. The question is the caterpillar the same thing as the butterfly? Technically, I mean, it's going through this process, so it should be the same, but you notice it's in a different form entirely. So very much with this idea, like to connect it with the cycle of rebirth, we are not necessarily our physical body, right? And this is what ultimately what the Buddhist tradition like believes in. Like, we have a certain level of consciousness that we're traveling with, right? And the cycle of rebirth is not necessarily with the physical body, but with the consciousness that we travel with. And so pretty much everything that we do in this current lifetime, you build up merits, you do good deeds, like for example, volunteering, etc. You're ultimately going to help your consciousness. It's going to travel with you from this life into the next life. So that's pretty much this idea of the cycle of the wheel of rebirth. Like, human beings, we are constantly traveling through this idea. So what's the point of Buddhism then, right? The point of Buddhism is so that, like, if we are within this cycle of rebirth, we can actually, if we study Buddhism enough and find this level of enlightenment, we can actually escape this cycle of rebirth over and over again. Because technically, birth, death, and just living life within itself, it's full of suffering, right? And while it's good that like we're doing good deeds in this lifetime, and then let's just say we're reborn again as a human, we'll go through the same process of like just birth, getting old, getting sick, and then dying. And it's basically a life of suffering. If you follow and study like the Buddhist tradition, the point is so that we can like get to a level where we can actually escape this cycle of rebirth. And ultimately, when you find enlightenment and escape this is how you're able to, you know, separate yourself from this idea, this level of following the cycle. There are certain monks and certain teachers who, out of compassion, they have this like option. Well, I wouldn't even, it's hard to explain what it is, but there's something called a Bodhisattva, right? And the Bodhisattva is somebody that you can think of like Wang Am, or they call her Kuan Yin. She's a Bodhisattva. And basically, what it is that they are people who were able to attain a level of enlightenment, and they're able to escape the cycle rebirth, but they also want to come back into this realm to help other people attain enlightenment as well. And that's like basically the role of bodhisattvas to begin with, right? They've done all the good deeds, they've studied Buddhism, they found enlightenment, and they have this choice, and out of compassion for people, to help people actually attain the same level of enlightenment to escape this like cycle of rebirth, they come back to help us figure this out as well, okay? And that is pretty much everything that I had to say about the cycle of rebirth. I'll probably add more onto it next week to see anything else. But I find this topic to be extremely curious. Does anybody have any questions? Not that I'm the expert on this, but and I would love to ask like the monk interesting questions about rebirth as well. But anybody have any questions about this? Okay. If not, that's my conclusion to this discussion then. All right. If not, thank you. And come back next week for another discussion on this. Awesome, thank you.